Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Neera Tandon, and I am President and CEO of the Center for American Progress. There is really no more important issue in America today than how families can make ends meet. There are a lot of crises all around us, but undergirding so much of the anxiety in our country is this basic concern that people's wages are not keeping up with the higher and higher cost of living. Across the country, rents are up, housing costs are up, and people have the most basic of concerns, which is how to keep a roof over their head. Essentially, we are seeing rents that have risen 30, 40, or 50% since the start of the pandemic. And owning a home has begun to feel like an impossible dream. And the median age for first-time home buyers is 40 years old. 40 years old to get your first house. These are problems we have to tackle. And that's why CAP, Center for American Progress, released a plan that would make housing drastically more affordable, easing rent burdens up to $1,000 annually in the highest cost cities, and lowering the cost of buying a home by an estimated $24,000. Our agenda, and we're so pleased to say, the agenda of Senate Democrats is really a simple truth. America's housing affordability challenges are ones that we can tackle, and we can do that by building more housing, by ensuring that we are lowering costs and really delivering on lower prices. Many cities and states are taking incredibly bold actions, reforming zoning and land use rules, expediting the permitting process, really investing in housing, public and private housing, and breaking down barriers around housing production. But the truth is that these actions are taking place against the backdrop of a Trump administration that is actually raising the costs of housing. I know that's surprising, but it is actually true. The Trump administration's tariff policies are raising costs by making it harder and more expensive to build. It's harder to import, it's more costly to import, and that means that construction materials are more expensive and buying a home is more expensive. Adding $17,500 in costs for every new home on average. At a time where we're trying to lower costs, the fact that the administration is raising those costs is something that tells you really where they stand. So obviously we have a lot more to do, and that's why we're so incredibly excited. The leader Schumer and Senate Democrats are fighting to lower costs for everyone across a range of issues, but starting with housing, the largest expense in most people's budgets. The leader has worked on affordability for decades. He's a longtime advocate for the low-income housing tax credit, which has financed nearly 4 million homes since its inception, and he's been focused on rental assistance and ensuring that everyone can access a home. I worked with him when I was the legislative director for another senator, and he was focused directly on ensuring that working class and middle class families can afford to live, can afford rents. During COVID, Leader Schumer passed into law the largest investment in rental relief in history through the American Rescue Plan, helping millions of renters escape eviction and more than 400,000 households avoid foreclosure. That's an agenda that matters. So we're so excited that he is here today. He is working with Senator Warren to pass the first bipartisan housing legislation, the Road to Housing Act, in well over a decade. He is a tireless champion on these issues, and we are excited that he is outlining the first of many affordability agenda items that Senate Democrats are going to work on this year, because they recognize that the real challenge, there's, again, a lot of noise, a lot of issues, but fundamentally, people's anxiety is that they just can't keep up with the cost of living. And they are looking for leaders who understand that. And we're so grateful that Senator Schumer is a leader they can look to on this issue. Senator?
Well, good morning, everybody, and it is really great to be here. I want to thank Neera and CAP for hosting this important, whoops, got my little cards here. That's my schedule. I wouldn't know where to go the rest of the day. I want to thank Neera and CAP for hosting this great, important policy summit on the affordability crisis Americans face, focusing on housing. CAP has been just a haven for thoughtful, innovative solutions for our nation's most difficult problems throughout the years I've been in the Senate. When there's a sticky, difficult problem, CAP is one of the first places I always call, and Neera has had great leadership both on and off the Hill. She understands how the legislative process works. She understands policy to a degree that very few others do. And so, and CAP has been instrumental in helping shape the housing policy agenda we're rolling out today. I also want to thank my colleagues who are going to participate later in the program, both of whom have been very active in housing, and those are Senator Schatz and Senator Duckworth, who you'll hear from later, and Jared Bernstein, and today's panel of experts. Thank you. Jim Parrott from the Urban Institute, Bharat Ramamurthy, who has been a true leader. I've known him for years working on policy issues. David Gonzalez-Rice with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and Sean McGarvey, the president of the Building Trades, a great leader. He is always there, always fighting for working people and also fighting for the good of the American people. He makes sure that we have working Americans get better pay, better benefits, and better representation in the workplace. So thank you all for being on the panel. I know everyone here looks forward to hearing from you. So, we meet right now at a moment of crisis for the American spirit. Across the country, tens of millions of families, people living paycheck to paycheck, people clinging on to the middle class, are asking them the same question from one end of the country to the other. Is America still a land of opportunity? Does the promise of this country still deliver for me and my family? And for too many Americans, the answer has become no. And the reason is the cost of living is far too high. And under Donald Trump, this crisis has gone from bad to worse. Trump's tariffs have raised costs for automobiles, clothing, furniture, even coffee and groceries. His Secretary of Agriculture says, just spend less. It can cost around $3, the Secretary said, for a meal, for a piece of chicken, a piece of broccoli, a corn tortilla, and one other thing. These people are not serious. They almost sound like they never had to feed a family. They never had to go to a supermarket. It's just incredible. Trump's big, beautiful bill, meanwhile, raised health care costs, booted millions off insurance, and on January 1st, we saw tens of millions of Americans saw their premiums double on average because Donald Trump and Republicans let the ACA premium tax credits expire despite all of our efforts. I'm sure last night there were tens of millions of American families sitting at the dinner table saying, how are we going to pay these bills? Do I pay my whole health care bill and stop saving for my retirement? Do I buy the new car or cut back on groceries? These are the kinds of questions that vex average families more than just about anything else. If you can't provide a decent life for yourself and your family, you don't think things are very good. So this is just a crisis that has just become unmanageable for too many families. Working Americans are anxious, they're worried sick, and then they're left wondering, who the hell is fighting for me with all of these problems? Well, as we begin 2026, Senate Democrats have a message for the country. We hear you. We hear you loud and clear, and we're getting to work. Every day, every week, every month this year, Democrats will put costs front and center in our agenda. It will be our agenda now and on throughout 2026. This spring and over the next 3 months and through 2026, Democrats will show precisely how a Senate Democratic majority will lower costs for everyday expenses. Right. We'll go issue by issue, spending weeks at a time, deliberately in depth, rolling out a battle plan for each front of the war of high costs. No matter where you live in America, no matter where you live, if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, or not political at all, we know that you should know we are hearing you. In a few weeks, we'll present a plan to the American people for how to lower their grocery costs. A few weeks later, we'll unveil a vision on how to lower electricity and energy costs. We'll present a plan that'll help parents afford child care and help families afford health care. Lowering costs will be our North Star, now and for all of 2026. And when Senate Democrats win the majority, the first thing we're going to do is get to work to enact these policies to lower the cost of living. Today, we begin this effort by focusing on housing. No matter where you live in America, no matter if you're a Republican, a Democrat, an Independent, everyone worries about cost, and everyone worries about housing affordability. Owning a home means building wealth, building a future. It's one of the most important parts of the American dream, if not the most important. Young families, when they own a home and pay that mortgage each month, they know they're building equity, they're building a future, they have something they can leave for their children. But as we all know, over the last few decades, the American dream of owning a home has become more of a mirage. It was a very realizable dream years ago. And most people, even at the lower income levels, thought, I can afford a home. They don't think so anymore. And that's devastating to them. The median price of a home, Neera pointed some of these out in her good intro, has increased by 55% since COVID. Rent is up by a third. And as Neera mentioned, I think of this all the time. The average first-time home buyer is 40 years old. 40 years old before you can buy a home. That's a record high. That's a devastating statistic that should shake up everyone in a position of power at the federal, state, or local levels. The statistic is just so confounding and deeply troubling. And when the rent or the mortgage is too high, you can't afford much else. It squeezes every other aspect of your life. If you can reduce the cost of your housing, on the converse, you have room to afford many things you need daily. And right now, America is short millions of housing units, driving up costs everywhere. Now, this crisis did not happen overnight. It wasn't always this way. Nearly a century ago, FDR instituted the nation's first ever laws to help Americans afford housing. And he declared, FDR did, quote, the right of every family is to a decent home. The GI Bill after World War II made low-interest loans available to millions and millions of Americans, of American veterans. The Great Society saw the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Section 8 vouchers brought rental assistance to millions of low-income families. Fair housing laws ensured affordable housing while fighting discrimination. The history is clear, my friends. When the federal government leads on housing policy, Americans are better off. But we know this began to change in the 1980s. The Reagan administration shifted its focus from serving working Americans to helping business interests increase their bottom lines. The federal government's ambitious housing policy ossified and shrunk. Now, I want to be very clear that both parties ignored the decades-long housing crisis, a truth we Democrats must confront and own. But under Donald Trump, our housing crisis and the affordability crisis in general has reached a boiling point. Trump tried to cut tens of billions of dollars to help people with rental assistance, help prevent homelessness, help enforce fair housing, help build affordable housing. He just cut and cut and cut with, my view, little even thought as to the consequences. He raised his tariffs have raised housing construction costs, as Neera mentioned, by $17,500 a home. $17,500, an increase in the cost of your home because of Donald Trump's tariffs. And now he's launching a criminal investigation against the chair of the Federal Reserve, a brazen attempt to cannibalize the Fed's independence. The decision will cause chaos in the housing markets, and that increases costs, because when there's chaos and politicization at the Fed, interest rates are more likely to go higher and stay higher. The lenders hold on tight and they say, we better not take any risks. We better pad our balance sheets with higher costs because we don't know what's going to come next. Then he's launching a criminal investigation, Trump is, against the chair of the Federal Reserve, a brazen attempt to cannibalize the Fed's independence. This decision could cause chaos in the housing markets as well. And, he's kneecapped the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as well. That protects against predatory corporate behavior and targets renters and home buyers. He's made this absurd proposal of a 50-year mortgage, which is just inane and unserious. The minute he came out with it, just sort of popped into his head, as lots of very bad things do. But unlike many other people, there's no filter. And out it comes, with deadly consequences in many cases. But anyway, it was ridiculed immediately by the left, by the right, by the center. Here's another one that just kills me. They've been trying this for years, but he's giving it a renewed push, the privatization of Fannie and Freddie. It's so obvious that'll raise costs for working families if you privatize Fannie and Freddie. But they're proposing it. Ironically, the only decent idea Donald Trump has floated recently on housing is one he stole from Democrats, calling for an end to institutional investors gobbling up homes and crowding out individual families. Democrats think we should pursue this idea, and in fact, we tried to get it done last year. We had an amendment to the reconciliation bill, which we all voted for, and they all voted against. And this is Donald Trump's Achilles heel. Even when he tries to do something good, he tries to sound like a populist, but in reality, he's a posturer. He never does anything to follow through. Pops out of his mouth one day, and then he's on something else the next day. Trump, if you care about preventing these institutional inventors from gobbling up homes, get the Republican senators and the Republican House members to join us in voting for it. Don't just posture. He thinks when he throws out these populist-sounding things, he can persuade people he's on their side. But he never lifts a finger or picks up a phone to get the Republicans to Congress to act. Here's a case in point, a recent one. House Republicans blocked progress on real and necessary housing legislation, namely the Road to Housing Act, which Elizabeth Warren's worked so hard on and includes so many good bills that Senate Democrats have fought for over the years. But even though it passed bipartisan in the Senate, Donald Trump didn't lift a finger to stop House Republicans from axing the road to housing. Well, the American people have had enough. What the American people want isn't rocket science. They simply want lower costs, an ability to live a decent life and feel positive about the future. The American people, simply put, want opportunity. And Democrats believe that when it comes to creating opportunity, opportunity must start at home. So that's why I'm calling our housing agenda Opportunity Starts at Home. When Donald Trump spends billions in taxpayer dollars on foreign wars, Democrats will focus on investing here at home and lower costs for the American people here at home. And what does that mean practically when it comes to housing? A Democratic majority will tackle the housing affordability crisis by working to do these things: to reduce rent, to boost homeowner ownership, to stop predatory corporations, to supercharge construction, and to provide housing security for all Americans. This is how we create opportunity. This is how we'll lower housing costs for the American people. So let me go a little bit through each. Rental relief. The Democratic majority will fight to deliver real, robust rental relief for every tenant in need. Because when it comes to lowering costs, rental relief is one of the best short-term fixes on the table. Republicans aren't even talking about rental relief at all. But we Democrats actually delivered on rental relief in the past, as Neera mentioned. When I was majority leader in the depths of the COVID crisis, Democrats entered into the law robust expansion for rental assistance and emergency housing vouchers. We saved millions from eviction. We gave people the space and means to find their footing. And there's still that crisis going on, not all at once because of COVID, but every day in every part of America. And the same types of relief are needed. Democrats have also fought long and hard to expand Section 8 vouchers to reduce rental costs, and will focus on expanding necessary rental relief to even more Americans who need help with the crushing cost of rent. Second, boosting home ownership. Democrats will expand the promise of home ownership for every American looking to buy a home. We'll help with down payment assistance, critical for the first-time and first-generation buyers. We'll lower the cost of mortgage insurance. I don't know why that hasn't been done. So essential in these days when down payment costs so much. We'll expand access to portable and assumable mortgages as well. They should be portable, they should be assumable, much more easily than now. We'll reform homeowners insurance, which is now at a crisis level and so important for people who can't afford that down payment. And that's especially true on our coasts and in communities prone to wildfires. Homeowners insurance is vital, and the cost is going through the roof so that people can't sell their homes, people can't buy their homes. It's so important to reform. Now, these are just some of the ideas on the table that a Democratic majority will push to make home ownership easier, less expensive, more sustainable. Excuse me. Third, predatory companies. Democrats will hit back at predatory institutions that are guilty of raising prices, abusing tenants, shutting millions of working and middle-class families out of the housing market. Even though some of our Republicans don't get it, corporations are not people, and they shouldn't be allowed to gobble up entire neighborhoods so easily and turn them into profit machines. A Democratic majority would work to put a stop on this poisonous trend. As I said, even Donald Trump says he likes this idea. Too bad he'll never get it done. The Republicans in the House and Senate will not do it. We have to get the majority to do these things. Democrats will also crack down on companies that artificially raise prices by using price-fixing algorithms to help landlords collude with each other and figure out how they can squeeze the maximum rent out of each individual in each individual case. It's using technology for a very bad purpose. And one of my favorites, which I've delivered on for years, I used to do Sunday press conferences on this. It's one of my favorite policies. It's ending junk fees. In this case, rental junk fees that prey upon families already struggling to keep up with the rent. Fourth, build more housing. We have to build more housing, plain and simple, no ands, ifs, or buts. A Democratic majority will launch a national effort, a nationwide mission to build housing to reduce costs in every state, every community, every neighborhood in need. We'll work with anyone, Democrats, Republicans, federal, state, local leaders, labor leaders, developers, faith leaders, anyone to get it done. And a good start, again, is for the Republican House to pass the Road to Housing Act. The Senate's done its job, thanks to the leadership of Elizabeth Warren. And now the House and Donald Trump must do theirs and get the road to housing over the finish line. But we have to do more. Elizabeth and everyone else says that's just the first step. There's a lot more that must be done. We must cut unnecessary red tape, and encourage local zoning reform by providing incentives and disincentives, carrots and sticks, for localities to reform outdated rules, to wipe away rules that get in the way of building housing. Senator Schatz has been a great leader on this, and we'll have more to say about it. We have so many talented people in our caucus, and my job is to take those ideas and blend them and weave them into one strong program that we can all support. And Schatz has been great on this issue. We'll also expand the Housing Trust Fund to create new middle class and create a new middle class housing emergency fund to invest in public housing. Senators Warren and Warnock are working on this already. And we'll work to get Fannie and Freddie to provide a national secondary market for construction loans to finance multifamily housing. Making construction loans cheaper makes housing more available and more affordable to many. I also have legislation I'm working on with Senator Duckworth to empower HUD to invoke the DPA, the Defense Production Act, guaranteeing the purchase of housing materials in short supply and scaling production of modular and manufactured housing. This is something Senator Slotkin has also called for. But again, the DPA, when there was a national emergency, a war, we used the DPA. We have a national emergency in housing. Use the same thing, the same basic policy tool. We also want to create a new ARPA home program, which will provide new thinking and new innovation to bring housing costs down. DARPA did it for defense. We can do it for housing with a housing ARPA. So this is just one of the many pieces of legislation we've worked on, and we benefited from CAP's knowledge and insight because they helped create these ideas. Separately, we're also going to work to expand something that's been something I've long championed, even when I was in the House, and that is the low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC. Maria Cantwell's done great work on this as well, and we know this works. So now, as we talk about increasing construction, every single one of us must be clear about something else that's important. Democrats will reject the false choice between building more housing and paying our construction workers a decent wage. We will not abandon organized labor like Donald Trump. We will empower them by ensuring they receive good pay, safety on the job, and with legislation to train a new generation of trades workers to build America, including housing. Finally, housing security for all. We must ensure financial security and opportunity for all communities. That means we need some targeted investments to end homelessness, to provide quality housing for veterans and for seniors, to rebuild communities that have been left behind, and we will enforce fair housing laws to deliver fair and affordable housing to all Americans. Now, these are just some of the things that Democrats will push to lower housing costs for the American people. As you can see, we've thought this through. We have a broad and comprehensive program that can really work. So, this is what our Opportunity Starts at Home agenda looks like. As I mentioned before, because I'm so passionate about this, in the weeks and months to come, you'll hear from Senate Democrats on our plan to lower other costs as well. Food costs, energy costs, the cost of groceries, health care, child care, and so many other things that Americans pay for every day. The point is this, folks. Republicans had their chance to show Americans they're serious about solving the housing crisis, and they have failed. They have failed. So, we Democrats will offer what the American people desperately need, a way forward. That's what our Opportunity Starts at Home agenda does. It shows the way forward to revive our nation's housing policy. The dream of owning a home might seem like a mirage now, but there's no good reason it cannot turn into a new oasis of future prosperity. Democrats are ready to get to work. We want to deliver on the vision of the right of every family to a decent home. We have the right ideas, We have the right proposals, and once we get the majority, we can start bringing these ideas to life. I welcome your involvement in making this happen. Thank you. Got all these papers all over them. Some people get one of those books. I think I need to turn the pages.
Thank you so much, Senator Schumer, for the really robust agenda. And we're really grateful again for you announcing the start of the Senate Democrats' affordability agenda. And opportunity at home really is, opportunity starts at home really does encapsulate it. I'll just start off on a general question, which is in some of the research we've done polling on housing before, and we found that in our data, 3 out of 4 Americans, 3 out of every 4 Americans, 75% of Americans think housing affordability is a top concern. You are outlining a broad and robust agenda. I think one of the things that's really surprising for people to hear is how much the current administration's policies are adding to that burden, not just with tariffs, but with the uncertainty created by the attacks on the independence of the Fed, and a strategy that is inflationary instead of addressing lowering costs. So just how do you see, how are Republicans in the Senate on this? How are they reining in the administration anyway? And how do you see driving this contrast?
Well, let's start out with this. I mean, on this issue, which is so dominant, when if you go to your local barber shop or local supermarket or local church or religious organization, this is what people talk about. The older people talk about their children not able to buy a home. The children talk about, the kids talk about their inability and how much they want to do it and how it's become so out of reach. And this is not just true in blue areas. This is true across the country. Upstate New York has the 3rd largest rural population in America. I'm up there a lot. As you know, I visit every county every year. And this is what people are talking about. And it amazes me, Neera, how the administration is just in a bubble about this. When Vote just cuts these programs that have helped at least prevent or sharpen the slope of prices going up, of preventing the slope of prices going up, they don't even know what they're doing. They just say, we got to cut. So you'd think, in reference to the second part of your question, that the Republican senators who should be in touch with their people, the Republican Congress members who should be in touch with their people, would say, we got to do something about this. But mum is the word. This Congress, Senate and House, Republican, have just let the executive branch dominate. And when the executive branch is in this bubble and has no understanding of what average Americans are going through on housing and everywhere else, they're supine, they do nothing. Now, it is a good news, that on Elizabeth's, she worked very hard on her bill, on her proposal. And we did get the Republicans to go along. But there wasn't real enthusiasm. You didn't hear many floor speeches about it. And no one's putting pressure on Johnson in the House to move it forward, even though it got such bipartisan support in the Senate.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we have time for just 1 or 2 audience questions. So get your questions ready. You talked a lot about a variety of proposals. And I guess I just want you to talk a little bit about housing supply. Completely agree with you that it's crucial that as we're building more, we have high labor standards, that this is an opportunity to also create jobs, create jobs that are always here because the houses are here. So in terms of housing supply, how do you see that, the centrality of that to addressing the problem?
I think it's important. It's important for us at the federal level to address this issue and do it ourselves. But it's also important in our proposals. As you see, we decided to increase the funding that goes to localities, because not one size fits all. And letting the localities decide the better way to increase housing supply, but giving them some of the resources to do it, makes a great deal of sense. And we all know there's all kinds of zoning and other problems, which I think has broad acceptance now in the Democratic caucus, from the most liberal to the most moderate people, that we have to do something. So, and we've worked with you on this, we propose both carrots and sticks. You get more money if you undo some of these restrictive laws, but you get less money if you don't undo some of these restrictive laws. And we think that'll have a real effect on increasing housing supply in the areas where zoning and other rules have stood in the way.
Great. Audience questions. Now, just on the audience questions, please have a question, make it brief. I will enforce that. And if you can identify yourself, that would be great. There's a question in the back.
Hi, my name is...
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, that helps with the mask. Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a commercial building owner in a small town in Washington State who's explored trying to convert buildings to affordable housing while meeting commercial needs in, excuse me, on the main street. But most federal grants and incentives for low-income housing make it very difficult to do mixed use.
Yeah.
In your policy proposals, are there any improvements that you could see for helping small towns maintain their main street while implementing low-income housing? Thank you.
Yes, there are, and this is something we're giving a great deal of thought to, not just in small towns, but across the country. When there is when the amount of commercial space that's needed is declining, we need incentives, federal tax incentives and local financial incentives to allow some of that commercial space, whether it be a small storefront in a small town, and we have lots of those in New York, or a larger office building in one of the bigger cities, to convert that. Senator Stabenow had a great proposal before she left on doing that, and Senator Klobuchar and people in the Ag Committee are looking at that right now. So it's a very important thing to do. We also have asked our ARPA to come up with other ideas that will make it easier to move on the path to that kind of conversion.
Great. Other questions? There's a question right here. It's coming.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I'm one of your classmates. My name's Eddie Eichis. And
Eddie Eichis, we were in law school together.
You're right.
Wow, you look a little different.
So do you.
I'm sure we did all do.
Mr. In law school in those days, it was Mr. Eichis.
Right. So
Wow.
I worked
Were
at...
you from the Bronx or something?
No, I was from Rome. And you met my parents, actually, in
Right.
Rome, New York. You were
In
a hero.
Rome, he was from New York.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about, I worked at HUD. I started as a political in the Carter administration. I worked 38 years, 20 of which president of the union. HUD's been completely decimated, especially fair housing and all these other things. Turner, when he was appointed, at least promised that he'd HUD, he'd work, he'd keep the programs. And then when Doge came in, that was the end. And I wanted to know what you can do about bringing HUD back. A lot of people took the fork in the road.
Yeah, if you look at the budget actually we're working on right now, and we'll have the T-HUD budget, transportation and HUD budget, we restore most of the cuts and even go higher than previous years on many of the programs that Doge slashed. When I met our nominee for HUD secretary, then he was nominee, he talked a nice game, but he doesn't seem to have the clout to make those views prevail over the Doge people, over the cut people. But we have worked really hard in the budget and gotten bipartisan support to increase these amounts and undo a lot of the cuts, which are essential, Mr. Righteous.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that, on just that point about HUD? I think it's not been a secret that HUD has not received funding it should over many years. I guess as we think to the future, we now live in a time where the president has a lot of authority to change how agencies run. And I think we can think afresh about some of these agencies. I think HUD has not often been considered a place that is really responsible for affordable housing for the whole country. It is seen as something that's organized for some cities, et cetera, but not really responsible for making sure the dream of home ownership, for example, is available to all Americans. How do you see changing that mission? Again, that might be hard with Trump as president, but for the future,
Absolutely.
how can Senate Democrats think through
Yeah,
that?
we think this is a national crisis, as you can see by our agenda.
Yes, absolutely.
We have not focused on one particular area or two or three. And I think the new HUD secretary, in 2029 or who knows, has to have that mission. That was the mission in the 30s. And even when the HUD first started, it was much more of the mission. And when it was, 1964 or 65. And it's been lost. And frankly, it's been lost under both Democratic and Republican administrations, where things went a little bit too much. Even people who wanted to do good things pigeonholed. We got to go back to this, just like feeding hungry children, just like providing health care for everybody is a national mission. Housing has to be as well. It fell off the wagon over the last 30 years. It has to be put back on.
Thank you again. It's a great place to end because we're so excited that with your leadership, with the leadership of Senate Democrats, housing is front and center, will be front and center, and we will actually have action that housing is an area where we know it's an area, with additional supply, with additional federal support, you can deliver lower costs, lower rents for people who are in apartments, and lower housing for all Americans. So we are so grateful.
And I'd say one other point here related to just what you said, Neera. There is a lot of focus on home ownership and ability of families to buy homes, but we can't forget there are a lot of renters who can't afford or don't want a home, and we can't forget giving them relief as well.
And that's what's great about the plan. It both lowers rents and lowers costs of houses for people to basically lower that age so that people can have access to the American dream, not in their 40s, but maybe even their 30s and 20s. Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you.
We're so grateful. Leader
Thank you.
Schumer.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Now I'm going to invite up our senators, Senator Duckworth and Schatz. I'm going to do my introduction as we get the stage ready for them. I want to thank Senator Schumer again for his effort to make life more affordable for working families. We are really excited for the very broad agenda that they will be outlining, that Senate Democrats will be outlining, but really excited that they're starting with housing. And now we're excited to bring up our next two speakers, Senators Brian Schatz and Tammy Duckworth. Senator Schatz helped create the Pro-Housing Federal Program, which rewards jurisdictions that increase the supply of housing, affordable housing, by correcting exclusionary zoning and land use policies. We know there's a lot more work to do here, but this is an incredibly important policy. He also co-authored the bipartisan YIMBY Act, which encourages the localities to cut onerous regulations and make it easier to build. Senator Duckworth has long been a strong advocate for safe and affordable housing for the most vulnerable. As President Obama's Assistant Secretary for Veterans Affairs, she worked to end veteran homelessness, and in the Senate, she has fought for new funding to support and modernize public housing. Both Senator Schatz and Senator Duckworth represent the kind of leadership our country needs right now. They are looking for solutions to this crucial problem, and I'm so grateful that they are here. And please, I'd love to welcome you to the stage. Guys.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. We just had a great conversation with Senator Schumer about the broad agenda that you guys are working on to lower costs. And housing is a comprehensive problem, and there's a range of challenges, but I guess I wanted to just first start off with both of you. You come from very different states. You're both working on housing from different angles, but all focused on lowering costs, making it much more affordable. So I'd love to just get your perspective to just start off why you're focused on housing and what is the most important set of issues from your perspective. Senator Duckworth?
Well, for me, it's about the fact, my lived experience, that buying that home, my first home, was really the first step to generational wealth for my family, right? I grew up poor. I was on food stamps. My dad was unemployed. I was, literally 6 hours away from being homeless at one point. Headed to a homeless shelter in Hawaii where I was living when a lady wrote a check that got my family and I into a pay-by-the-week motel. And using that VA home loan to buy my first home with no money down, $93,000 was this house out in the cornfields of Illinois, was the first step, because then we leveraged that, and then later on we bought the $200,000 house, and then, that experience of, now we have some equity, some capital in the family, and that was the first step in my family on either side towards actual home ownership and owning something. And so I want that for everyone. But I have young staff members who cannot buy a home. They're out of touch. I've talked to, I had this experience where in Illinois, in Galesburg, Illinois, the city manager could not buy a home in his city because they were all out of reach, because there was no stock.
Yeah.
And when there was stock and he tried to build a prefab home, the quote that he got was $500,000. He says, I can't build a $500,000 home in Galesburg, Illinois, where the average home, I will be in a pit. So the fact that it continues to escalate, the prices of homes in Illinois, whether it's Chicago or Bloomington or Galesburg, has increased at the over 38 to 40% rate, far outpacing income.
Yeah, that point, which is so central, which is that housing is how people build wealth in our country, that the value of the house is really the vast majority of Americans, except for the very top percentage. That's how they're building wealth, not just for their future, for their retirement, for their kids' future. And when that's inaccessible, or you access it so much later in life, it's harder to build that wealth over your life. Senator Schatz, what has brought you to this set of issues?
I've been radicalized on housing, and the reason is that our shortage nationwide, but especially in Hawaii, is so acute that people can't make the math work anymore. In Hawaii, people are paying more than 50% all in of their income for housing, either rental housing or paying a mortgage. And what I have come to realize is that we are the problem. And it is hard to be a proud member of the party that wants to defend the government and to say that the government is the primary impediment to alleviating this shortage. It has resulted in some very difficult conversations at the Manoa Safeway with some old friends, politically old friends, and some personal old friends who are saying, hey, what are you doing here? But for me, when I joined the banking committee, I'm no longer on the banking committee, but when I joined the banking committee, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't quite understand that all of the, in my view, curdling of the environmental movement into this aggressive sort of John Birch Society NIMBYism, that I've got mine, and I'm going to protect my view and my personal convenience over the needs of the many. It made me realize that we've got some family conversations to conduct.
Yes.
And that I think one of the things that's happening because Trump is in charge of the government is we are no longer reflexively defending every agency, every law, every rule, every process. And it gives us this opportunity to say, hey, look, in the state of Hawaii, we've got extraordinary, and we should, environmental and cultural protections. But they are designed to protect special places, whether it's biodiversity or cultural significance. They were not originally conceived to prevent a walk-up apartment building on the corner of Eisenberg and King to house Native Hawaiian families. And yet those same laws are being weaponized against people in Hawaii even being able to live in the state of Hawaii. And so I think we have to solve the politics before, I mean, I got all kinds of policy proposals, as does Tammy, as do others, but I actually think we have to have this family conversation around the politics of housing and realize that some of our base voters in the suburbs who are otherwise good all the way down the line on all the progressive issues also want to prevent a nurse or a firefighter or the disabled or the elderly or the student from living anywhere near them. And we have to have that conversation in the Progressive Coalition. It's a perfect time to do it because there is a little bit of time, but I have come to the conclusion that we're not going to unlock the policy unless we shift the politics. And so I am, maybe against my own sort of political interests, having fights with the family to make sure that we say there's nothing progressive about preventing homes from being built.
Yeah,
So, just to follow up on that point,
absolutely.
these ideas are connected, right?
Yes.
Because one of the challenges in the United States, which is different from other places, is that people are building up so much of their wealth in their home, which makes them, the people who have the homes, anxious about increasing supply because that means the value of their home could decline. So, but that, for leaders at the local level in particular, then that's a trade-off because it makes it much more difficult to attract younger people into your community. You have to really, you have to address the fact that cities can essentially become unaffordable. Places can become unaffordable. So I guess the area of opportunity here is there's federal legislation, and CAP's proposal is to incentivize localities with federal funds and use the carrot and stick approach. But also we are seeing innovations at the state level. California has addressed some of the issues around environmental regulation that just stops housing. New York State is now looking at SECRA reform, just something that just rolls off the tongue. So I guess how do you see this family conversation playing out, given some of these blue states now are transforming their policies?
I think it's great, right? You have a number of Democratic governors and Democratic legislatures and mayors who are coming to realize a couple of things. First, this just is an urgent problem, and one of the problems I think politically for us over the last decade or so is that it's fine to describe a problem and even describe your solution set in such a way that is maximally popular, right? But when it's governing time, there may be a split between the way you characterize the problem and what is necessary to be done. And I think one of the things that we need to be ready to do is to actually deliver not on things that sound popular, but things that will alleviate the shortage of housing. And those are not all, sometimes they're the same thing, but sometimes they're not. And I just, my own judgment is that as we talk about affordability, you got to look at most people's expenses. And most people, it's housing, right? That comprises the largest percentage of their monthly expenses, unless someone's providing housing or for them, or unless they've already paid down their mortgage completely, and God bless if they have, but most of us are not in that position. And so I just, I just think that we have to be a little rough with each other, rough on the issues, easy on each other, of course.
This isn't the Trump administration. We're just rough everywhere.
Yeah, but I just...
And vindictive.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I'm just worried, I'm worried that we will describe this thing in the maximally popular way and not describe what we actually need to do to alleviate the shortage. There's a nationwide shortage. It should not be accepted that, like in the state of Hawaii, we're about 60,000 units short. I think California's maybe 2 million short. But in the state of Hawaii, 60,000 units is doable. But we have to not accept the premise that, we're land constrained and we're far away and land is expensive. The reason that it's hard to build housing is that we've done a bunch of things intentionally to make it hard to build housing. And yes, that's mostly local, but there are a lot of federal levers that we have yet to sort of use.
Excellent. Can I turn to you, Senator Duckworth, on your experience on veterans housing and and really grateful for your sharing your experience. But I think veteran housing and homelessness policies is fascinating.
Yes.
Because this is an area where the federal government acted. President Obama, your leadership had a direct focus on reducing veteran homelessness by making it easier for veterans to access homes. And it was an incredibly successful policy. Veteran homelessness in the Obama administration dramatically declined. What lessons do you take from that? I mean, because basically, as a federal government, we said, we just don't accept veteran homelessness. So we're willing to invest in it. And we're willing to make housing much more affordable for veterans. But support for that kind of stopped with veterans. So how do you, but I think we learned a lot of lessons, but basically if you actually invest, make it more financially affordable, people will actually take those homes. So how do you see that, the experience with veterans and our successes there, and what lessons can we take from that?
I think that's a great question, and it is out of that experience with trying to end veterans' homelessness that has brought me to this housing affordability issue. And I want to touch on what Brian said about the levers of government that are there. In VA, what we had to do was first we had to change the thinking at VA to get veterans off the street. So when we had homeless veterans, VA used to say, you have to get clean and sober, and then we'll give you a voucher to get into an apartment. And so it made no sense, right? So we had to change the thinking to what the homelessness community had been working on, which is reduction of harm. Get them into the housing and then work on getting them clean and sober. And by changing that thought, we were able to immediately start pulling veterans off the streets, put them into housing units where they were also getting counseling, getting treatment. We were telling veterans, you can't come to VA and get your health care for your chronic condition unless you can pass the drug test. And like they're on the streets, right? And so it was crazy. We had to change that, and we had to change VA regulation. So there is that lever that we can take place in, that we can work on. We can also use the power of buying, the power of the government to leverage. We can leverage that either through VA or also the VA home loan process or with military housing. So for example, there are things that we can do when we, under the VA home loan program, want to make sure that the veteran gets into the safest housing possible. But the inspection process and the approval process and the lack of housing inspectors in the VA system means that if you make a bid and you win a bid on a house, you may wait 3 months before that's finally approved. Sellers are not willing to wait that long. I actually have a staff member who tried to buy a home with her VA home loan. Both she and her husband are veterans. And they had the highest price that they bid, but the seller went with someone else because they didn't want to wait 3 months for that to happen. So we can change that process. One way that we could do it is kind of like, and another process is with how we approve. A lot of housing code is at the local level, but there are things that we can do at the federal level, especially if you look at, what I'm looking at is prefabricated housing, where palletized housing units. This is the kind of thing that could work for Hawaii, right? But you're still having to, when you're building a house, even with prefab units, have the inspector come in, stop construction, they inspect, stop construction, you inspect. That's not what we do with automobiles. With automobiles, we say, this car that you're manufacturing must be able to withstand a crash at 35 miles an hour into a brick wall. And then when they meet and get that car approved, when we go buy that car, we don't have to take that car to get it inspected from top to bottom like we do with homes. So why would we not say to home builders, especially prefab homes, if you come to VA and you are willing to get, 2 models of your home pre-inspected, pre-approved, then when a veteran builds a new home and they say, hey, I'm going to choose one of these models that already has the VA Good Housekeeping seal of approval, they can shortcut that inspection process. Those are things that we can do. I mean, because that local process, going back to what Brian said about internal family discussions, Illinois has the highest concentration of lead service lines in the country because our unions made it code to use lead service lines until 1985. Even when the rest of the country stopped using lead service line, because we were reinforcing ourselves. And so now we're in the process of having to replace all of those lead service lines.
I want to follow up on manufactured housing because one of the challenges on housing costs is that the costs have been basically the same for
Or
decades.
more expensive.
Or more expensive. I mean, in most places, in most areas of public life, costs for goods have declined over a long period of time. That's not the case in housing, because we haven't had much housing innovation. We haven't had much innovation in how to construct housing, et cetera. This leader talked about this, and you have a big focus on manufactured housing. And just how do you think of things like an ARPA for manufactured housing, ways in which we can invest in not just supporting manufactured housing, but making it much more affordable in terms of the cost of goods, et cetera?
Well, you have to ensure the marketplace and the scale, and this is where I think the DOD can come in. This is where the VA Good Housing Keeping Seal of Approval can come in. More people will start using those houses. But also, the DOD right now is going through a process where we went through under the George W. Bush administration in an attempt to upgrade military housing from what, when I joined the Army, we were still living in units that were built for World War II. And we'd have to have a fire watch in our in our barracks where somebody has to be awake all night long to make sure the place didn't catch fire. But what we did was we turned over the building of housing units for our military families to contractors. And it was a public-private partnership. And at first it looked really good. If you go around Pearl Harbor, those housing units are beautiful, right? We also had something like that in Illinois at North Chicago at Great Lakes, which is the only military basic training for the Navy. Except now, those builders did not fall under the chain of command of the base commander. And so when there started being mold, or they were not being well maintained, or there were leaks or whatever, the base commander had no power over the contractors. And so we ended up with all of these units that had to be condemned. So my question is, why don't we go back, and we're now rebuilding housing units, do something along the lines of, let's use the DOD and let's make the preference to use these modular homes that are pre-inspected to the highest level. And that creates a demand that then makes it, more viable for capital to be put into these manufacturers. And then you can work on the state level to say, hey, if you come to Illinois and you build your prefab home factory in Illinois and you make it a union shop, we'll give you tax credits or something.
Great. I'm going to go to audience questions. I'm just going to ask the senator one more question, so just get your questions ready. So a woman in the back just chomping at the bit, so I'll get to her in a second. I guess, Senator Schatz, I wanted to ask you, just building on some of your comments earlier, I think what's interesting about housing policy at the federal level is on one hand, it's really a fair amount of it, not all of it, but a fair amount of it is building supply. A kind of not traditionally conservative issue, liberal or conservative issue. It's just a practical issue. On the other hand, we do see you need some lever against zoning restrictions, other issues. So it calls for an important federal role. And I guess I would ask you, how do you see the opportunity of that going forward in the future in the Congress, given it's both of those things? It's kind of, Republicans have been for additional supply, but they're so anathema to a federal role unless it's invading another country or something like that, then that seems to be a friction point.
So I think you've got it exactly right. I would also just say that the NIMBYism is a bit of a paper tiger unless you are in the city council and you are deciding on an individual project. State legislators don't get ousted by passing YIMBY legislation, right? And the sort of theory of political change has to be, you got to elevate this above the individual site-based evaluation, because that's where people do actually have some political peril. But if you can blame the legislature and the legislature can blame the federal legislature, that's really the model for change, because as you know, everybody thinks there should be more housing, but not near them. And so one thing that we did several years ago when I was the chairman of the Transportation and HUD subcommittee is established the pro-housing grant program within HUD, which continues under this HUD, which basically provides incentives for municipalities and states that are loosening up the restrictions on zoning. So the aperture for getting this done, I think, remains pretty wide open because it has not yet been polarized between the political parties. There's lots to like if you're a progressive about making housing more available, and there's a fair amount to like if you're a reasonable conservative. If you're like a normie 1980s free market person, then you say, why would we constrain supply and have all these rules? If you're a Trump person, I don't know what to say, but but I think there are real opportunities, and we do have a piece of legislation that's been enacted that is starting to precipitate change. We need to do more of that. I know Lisa Blunt Rochester and Elizabeth Warren has been awesome. Tammy, there are just a number of people who are kind of leading in this space. And I think the nice thing, as you probably are all aware, there's a tendency among members of Congress to try to like keep their elbows high and say, this is my issue, I'm the mayor of this issue.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
We are trying as hard as we can not to do this because this is such a huge generational challenge that I think we need a dozen of us or more in the Senate that are working on it at the same time.
Great. Okay. Questions? Right there. If you just a reminder, identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Maria Jaramillo from National Disability Institute. So Senator Duckworth, how can we ensure the dream of affordable and accessible housing also be possible for people with disabilities? And this includes, accessible housing, but also products that don't punish individuals for saving for a down payment because this could impact their eligibility for federal needed benefits. Thank you.
So there's two things going on there. Persons with disabilities, in order to get home health aid care, and have to spend down their net worth to such a low point that before they can actually get help from Medicaid. And so they can't hold full-time jobs. They can't do, because once you reach a certain income threshold, now you lose the aid, the money for the aid that actually helps you get up in the morning, get in your wheelchair, and get out the door. It is self-defeating. So that's one of the things we need to fix. On the accessibility, I think, if we can get prefab home builders to pre-certify, 5 models of homes for VA, we can at VA say those 5 homes must be built with universal design. And that will flood the market, that'll increase the marketplace, and so that other people can also buy those prefab homes, and so that models 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meet VA requirements for home loans, but then the general population can do that as well. And so what we see happening, coming from the disability experience, is when you have federal regulation and when you use the federal levers to approve something for federal payment, for example, if a chair has been approved by Medicare and Medicaid for reimbursement, then generally the insurance, the civilian insurance population companies will actually also insure and pay for those wheelchairs. But if you have a wheelchair that is not approved by VA or by Medicare or Medicaid, then the insurance companies on the civilian side won't cover it. So by nature of VA saying, we're going to cover these 5 housing units, it makes them more accessible to the general population for mortgage brokers and other folks to say, okay, we're going to approve that.
That's great. Next question over here.
Hi, Senator Duckworth. Hello, Senator Schatz.
Do you want to identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Shaker with Beekman Advisors, a bit of a housing wonk. Look, it's fantastic that we're talking about housing supply. We have a huge shortage, rental and ownership units. But it's become a bit of a mantra. Everyone's buying into it completely, and I just want to throw a fallacy out in one suggestion. We overbuilt in Austin, Texas, for example, in apartments. It has lowered rents, but 90% of the apartments that have been built in the last 10 years have been built for the very high end of the market. They are essentially going to cost $300,000 a unit, $400,000 a unit. They can drift down over 10 years to being affordable to families making $75,000 to $100,000 a year, not low income, but moderate income. The question is, building just by itself may address shortage, but it doesn't address affordability. So I just want to make the point that the 2 times in America when we've actually built a lot of affordable apartments and homes, the United States government and the federal government has subsidized something.
Yeah.
And one was under the GI Bill and the other was in the 1970s. We either gave direct subsidies to renters through Section 8, or we gave lower mortgage rates. So there has to be a combination of, yes, we need to build, but we need to build affordable. And that's going to require the federal government to step up and actually underwrite some resources.
Yeah, we don't have a path towards Levittown or Chicago bungalows today, both
Yeah.
of which were subsidized by federal government.
I guess I'd say also, I mean, some of the policy proposals I know Senator Schumer talked about in terms of the carrots and sticks with federal dollars would ensure affordability, right? So you're putting more funding into the system to make housing more affordable, but then also the requirements for localities would ensure that the housing is also affordable.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm for as much subsidy as we can possibly muster, federal, state, and county. And I take in good faith your critique, and I think it's very valid. I think the problem is that at the local level, people demand capital A, capital H, affordable housing as an excuse to stop everything. I'll give you a particular example. The County of Maui said no new housing units unless they are capital A, capital H, affordable. And guess what happened? Not a single, and I mean not a single, housing unit got built in more than a decade. They had to repeal the ordinance because all of that stuff sounds lovely. Well, I'm for housing, but is it affordable? And we have seen this at least across the state of Hawaii, but I think it's across the country. Someone comes in and says, this is market rate apartments and whatever, and then the NIMBYs weaponize what you're saying. I'm not saying you're one of them, but they do weaponize what you're saying and say, you got to drive that AMI down, which all sounds virtuous because you're fighting for the poorest of the poor. But what you're doing is making sure that the pro forma doesn't pencil. And that the person that wants to do the development now has to go back to their lender and go like, I don't know how to make this work. I guess let's see if we can get some LIHTC money. LIHTC money is distributed to states, per capita, and it's finite. And so what you're saying is valid. It's also true that there are a bunch of people who say something that rhymes with that as an excuse not to build anything at all.
Right, and also, I mean, you have seen some significant innovations at the local level, right? In Maryland, they have public dollars. Those public dollars, they basically have public housing. The public housing is, though, mixed use. It's middle-class folks, it's lower-income folks, and it pencils out over time, in fact, to be sustainable. But it's also not a place where you're just saying we're only doing affordable housing for the lowest income, because I think the truth of this is that we're finding middle income, working class folks really having a hard time afford housing at all. So that's a great question, great exchange. Other questions? We have time for one more. Right here. And just a reminder to identify yourself and please ask a question.
Great. Hi, Senator Duckworth, Senator Schatz. My name's Adam Hawes. I work on industrialized construction for Department of Energy. So very excited to hear about the prefab ideas with the VA and DOD. I'm curious if either of you have heard anyone in your caucus talking about expanding those ideas. So not just having pre-certification for VA loans, but potentially FHA, potentially Fannie or Freddie.
That's where I would like to go.
Great.
I would start with
I think that would
do
be
all of them.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And similarly for DOD, demand aggregation, that's what other countries have done, driven down cost. Curious if you've seen any proposals for LIHTC or kind of aggregating other sources for affordable housing, because I think the DOD is a great start. I think that is a brilliant, pretty streamlined approach. But be curious if there's HUD money or other things that you could see kind of doing a similar approach for affordable housing for that type of kind of, 5 models making standardized so that there's a kind of broad national platform for purchasing.
Yeah, there was an effort to do this back in the day in like the late 70s. I think it was called Operation Breakthrough that HUD started. And then and it's funny because that, there's a great article about it if you guys just look it up. And it was such a good initiative that other countries came and visited, like Sweden and Japan. And then we canceled it because we decided it was too expensive. And then Sweden and Japan have used it. And now you see what they have in those 2 countries, which is a very robust prefabricated housing program that is government funded that went across all sectors of their society. So it did exist. It can exist again. We just have to relook it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that question. Thank you to these great leaders on housing. We're really excited. And now we have our next and final panel, which is with housing experts that will be led by my colleague, Jared Bernstein, who's a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress and formerly chair of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nara. It's good to see you.
Well, thanks, everybody. We're about to move to our panel, and I'm excited to have them here. Let me introduce them, and then I'll call them up. Bharat Ramamurthy is someone I worked with closely when I was at the White House in the Biden administration. He was a deputy director at the National Economic Council. Jim Parrott is currently at the Urban Institute, but Jim did really important housing work back in the day in the Obama administration when we worked together. So Jim is here. Sean McGarvey from the building trades. Very important to have Sean on the panel, so glad he's here. And David Gonzalez-Rice from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So what I want to do here is get into a pretty deep dive into the substance, reflecting on the report that, in part, the report that we wrote at CAP, and I want to thank my co-authors who are in the House, Chad Mizell, Natalie Baker, Michael Negron. I also want to make sure I give a shout out to Madeline Shepard and Emma Hurlburt for making this all happen and helping things run smoothly. On that note, let's bring out the panel. Just in the interest of time, because we have a ton to talk about, and I think we have about 30 minutes and then some Q&A. I'm going to get started while you're getting seated. I think the right place to start here, we've heard a lot about this already, is a quick discussion, and I'd like folks to try to be crisp, especially since much of this has been recounted already today. A quick take on what you think the problem is. I'd like this panel to be a lot more prescription than diagnosis, but you can't prescribe without the right diagnosis. So I want to see what kind of pages we're on when it comes to what we think is the fundamental problem we're trying to solve for here. And I'm going to start with Jim and then ask David to speak from the Jim maybe with more of an overview, David with a bit more of a focus on the low end, and then Bharat, I'm going to come to you and ask about any political blockages that your perspective on that, that part of the problem, and then Sean, I have a juicy question for you lined up right after that. So let's start with Jim.
Thank you, Jared.
I think you have a mic.
Oh, okay. Thank you guys for having me, or us. So it is, I'm thinking about housing affordability. I assume that's the problem we're diagnosing. So while it is sort of obviously true that being in this high rate environment for a long time has made mortgages more expensive, and that's part of the puzzle, the underlying much deeper problem is almost structural in nature, and it's a housing shortfall, which is driving up rents and home prices. And the reason why it's important to diagnose it that way is if you lean too heavily and exclusively into demand side stuff to bring rates down or otherwise, a lot of that subsidy, a lot of that relief is going to get sucked up into home price appreciation, higher rents, because if you've got a constrained supply and you're sending ever more people out to fight over that constrained supply, as a result, prices are going to go up. So the problem is mainly at its core a structural undersupply of housing, especially in the middle of the market. We've got no undersupply at the top of the market. The margins for building stuff at the top of the market have been fine for a long time. We've got an oversupply in a lot of the country at the top of the market. In the bottom of the rental market, we've had a long-standing undersupply. We just don't build enough affordable rental housing at the bottom of the market. But what we've got the deepest shortfall of, which is a more recent phenomenon, last 5, 6, 7 years, is right in the middle of the market. That is the market that serves middle-class folks, so entry-level houses to purchase, and so-called workforce rental housing. The market doesn't naturally serve that population well at all because there's not enough profit to build that stuff. And we've got no policies out there that provide any subsidy to make any of the economics better in the middle of the market. So you've got this particularly deep hole in the middle of the market that neither policymakers nor builders are inclined to fill without some help. So that's how I think about the problem.
Thank you. That was informative and crispy, so appreciated. David, can you take us down to that lower?
Sure. So with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we put out a couple of reports every year that take a look at this problem. One's called Out of Reach, the other's called The Gap, and they both tell the same story in a couple of different ways, that the gap between incomes and costs or rent is wide and getting wider, especially for the lowest income families. But to the point you just made, we're starting to see that same pattern filter upward into higher income brackets. But I think an important piece we need to tell as well is that for different populations around the country, that gap looks qualitatively different. And I'll refer back to some of the kind of bad habits and prejudices that Senator Schatz referred to, that we have a longstanding kind of bad habit in this country of neighbors not wanting to have other folks as their neighbors. That contributes a lot to why some folks have lower incomes and face higher barriers seeking housing that maybe even could be affordable to them but isn't. So whether we're thinking about older folks, folks with disabilities, communities that have been traditionally locked out of opportunity, there's real unevenness in that gap between incomes and housing costs around the country. And we can talk more about some of the policy pieces that address that.
Bharat, we've heard from a number of high-ranking senators today, and I thought they made some really compelling points. You and I were in the Biden administration trying to move these ideas, and I think arguably we didn't get nearly as far as we'd like. Can you talk a little bit about the political barrier part of the problem?
Yeah, as Jim got into there, if you believe, as I do, that a big part of the problem here is lack of supply, you can't snap your fingers and build 5 million new homes overnight. And so the sort of economically prescribed solution, which is to increase supply, takes a long time to kick in. And at the same time, you have a lot of urgency and distress right now where people want their rents to go down right now. They want to be able to buy a home right now. And so I tell the story about how I met with a group of tenants and tried to describe to them the Biden administration housing plan. And I said, if we have a plan to build 3 million new housing units over the 10 years, which according to our projections will slow the rate at which rent grows over that 10-year period. And they were like, my rent's going up 20% next month. What are you going to do for me? Right? And so this is the fundamental tension that I think exists. And I think the other fundamental tension that I think drives a lot of this issue is that we, for a variety of reasons, we want it to be easier for first-time home buyers to buy a home. We want rent prices to go down. But 65% of Americans are homeowners. And for many of those people, many middle-class people, their home is their biggest asset by far. And so they very logically, and I think it doesn't make them a NIMBY, it doesn't make them, not neighborly. They're saying we don't want a set of policies that's going to cause our main asset value to go down or appreciate less quickly. And so the fundamental tensions that we're dealing with are a temporal one, I would say, and a very clear trade-off one where you're asking current homeowners potentially to make sacrifices in the interest of future homeowners. And I think those political tensions are what makes housing policy so difficult.
Okay, so those were, I think, three excellent summaries of the problem, but I really want to push the three of you in your next intervention to tell me how you'd solve them. And the ones you just raised are, we've been trying to solve them forever, so I recognize it's a challenge. I also have one more supply side question, which I'll get to in a second, but I want to get Sean's voice in here. So Sean, you've heard the discussion today, and you are acutely aware of the role that labor costs play in housing. And you've also spent a career, and you and I know each other for a while, and you know that worker bargaining power and union power in my model of the economy, built and sustains the middle class. So we're on the same page there. How do you see construction worker unions playing a role in this affordability challenge? And is that a uniquely tough dichotomy for them, or is there a way in which those two forces go together to create a positive outcome?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you to Cap for having me on this distinguished panel. First and foremost, 50% of the construction industry is single-family housing. The building trades for probably 40 or on to 50 years now hasn't really played a part in single-family housing. There are some pockets around the country where we still do single-family housing. We were driven out of that marketplace by competition and low cost. Multifamily housing, we are very involved in and play an important role. Not only do we supply the workforce for multifamily housing, but we also finance it through instruments like the AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust, which is a almost $7.5 billion bond fund that's our pension dollars. They're invested into multifamily, low and moderate income housing, worker housing. That is a fund that was started in 1963 after a conversation with Martin Luther King Jr. and George Meany. And the first $1 million into that fund came from a building trades union. So the overwhelming majority in that fund is building trades union pension funds, which invest in low and moderate income housing. And the hook is that we build it. And we build it we're getting ready to start a multi-billion-dollar project in New York. We just broke ground in San Francisco. Senator Schatz was just here. We broke ground last year on a project in Honolulu. We're in LA. We're in all the most expensive markets in the country. And we can build it with a good rate of return for the investors, with 100% union collective bargaining, wages and fringe benefit packages, build it safely, on time, with the utmost quality. So we're engaged, involved, and support every aspect of building out the housing capacity in the country because one more group that is affected by the lack of affordable housing is our members themselves and their families, who also struggle at times to find housing that's close enough to where the work is so that they don't have a real quality of life issue with the commutes that they make back and forth to the job site every day.
Sean, is there a way in which, in some of these conversations, people have criticized the role of unions as raising the cost of housing? How do you think about that in the building trades?
Well, again, the cost of labor generally to build housing is 20% of the cost of the project. You don't want to exacerbate the problem of paying a workforce substandard wages so that you create the need for more affordable housing. There are studies out there that I've seen, quite honestly, Democratic politicians wave around that say the cost of doing this under prevailing wages raises the cost $175,000 a unit. Well, if that was reality, that would mean that workforce going to that job every day was actually paying money out of their pocket for the privilege of working on the job.
Right.
That old saying about numbers, right? If a situation presents itself where the economics are tough, the building trades is willing to step up to the plate and be a participant in making the economics work. All we ask is that we set up 25 barber chairs against the wall. We get 25 barbers, okay? We will take our appropriate seat, but have the attorneys, have the suppliers, have the developers, okay? Have the engineering companies, have everybody that participates down to the people that supply the porta-johns on the project all sit in one of those barber chairs and take the appropriate haircut.
Yeah.
The tendency is for everybody else to get their 100%, and then when it gets to labor, they're the problem. They need to take the massive haircut.
That's a great point. And, you know, right now we already heard in Neera's introductory comments that Trumpian tariffs are adding over $17K to the price of a house. So that would be a smart place to start if we want to do something about affordability. Bharat, let's move into prescription problem solving here. You made a point where you closed, which is one that I really haven't heard a convincing counter-argument, which is that while NIMBYism is obviously problematic, particularly when it comes to upzoning, you know, folks are protecting, in many cases, their main and only source of wealth. What are your thoughts about how that gets resolved here?
You know, I think it raises questions about the other side of the equation, which is not just the purchase of housing, but you know, how do we make housing affordable? Well, one thing is you could bring down the price of housing. The other thing you could try to do is to raise wages, make it easier for people to save, make it so that maybe their homes aren't their primary asset source, make it easier for them to save for retirement, be more invested in the stock market, have other sources of wealth. But the truth is that in the United States, for most middle-class families, you know, remember about 50% of families don't have any exposure to the stock market. For many people, their home is their source of wealth, and it's the thing that they intend to pass on to their kids and to give them a better life. And if you tell them you're going to have to dilute the value of this, and oh, by the way, you also may have to deal with more crowding in your schools and more traffic on your roads. Again, there are a whole set of zoning provisions that I think are unnecessary and should be removed. But I also want to give people some credit for being rational actors when it comes to thinking through these problems. You know, to me, there's a fundamental philosophical issue that I struggle with when it comes to housing. And sorry, I don't know if this necessarily answers your question, but you know, I think we all believe that housing is a necessity. You know, it's not like it's not like a lot of other consumer goods. People need a place to live, right? And as a country and as an economy, it's really, so that's a moral question, I think. But also as a country and an economy, it's really important that we have housing in the types of places that are going to raise productivity in the economy. We want more housing in places where there's good jobs and there's good schools. And so we have these both this moral and economic interest in housing, but we largely rely on the private sector to provide this housing. And the private sector, I'm not disparaging anybody, it's just true, the private sector is interested in making a profit on housing. And the profit maximizing incentives of folks in the housing industry aren't necessarily going to produce the outcomes that we want from either a moral or an economic perspective. And so then the question is, you know, what we've largely decided to do as a government is cajole the private sector to try to produce more of the outcomes that we want, but it's a very challenging, it's very expensive. It leads to pretty inconsistent outcomes. So for me, you know, I read the CAP report. I thought it was very interesting that there's more and more examples at the local level of the government directly getting involved in financing affordable housing, not doing it through tax credits, but in Montgomery County across the border, they had a very effective program. To me, those are the types of ideas I'd like to see expanded. The superpower of the federal government is that we can borrow more cheaply than anybody, and we don't need to get a return on our capital. And so that's, I think, a key way of getting more housing out into the world.
Yeah, we're going to get into the subnet. We have an idea in our report that is one of my personal favorites, so I'll tout that in a second. But Jim, let me ask you two questions. One, I'd like you to respond to what we just heard from Bharat. You spend a lot of time working in the private sector housing finance space, and I'd really be interested in your reaction and how the ideas you just heard resonate with you. And secondly, on the supply piece, and if this is, you know, a 15-minute answer, just tell me, we'll talk about it some other time. You know, we cribbed a great graphic from a piece that you and Mark Zandi and others had written that showed the, you know, at least when we were putting in our report, a housing shortfall that was north of 2 million. But if you actually look at that graph, we had a housing surplus a couple of years before that. Before the housing bust, if you look at your graph, there's a big bump that goes over the sort of neutral level, and then there's a big dip that goes below the neutral level, which is where we are now. But we had a lot of the same crappy policies in place back then as we have now. How did we have a housing surplus? And, you know, yet we have to make all these changes to get back to more
Yeah.
housing. So those are both tough questions, but see if you can.
Yeah. Okay. So on the first, I mean, the way I think about the problem and the set of solutions that are probably going to make the most sense. We've got a set of industries out there that are set up, designed, and incentivized to build stuff. And what we've got is a shortfall in certain categories of that stuff. And so I feel pretty comfortable, despite what Bharat said, which I'll come to in a second, changing the incentives, the economic conditions, so that these folks that have these sort of bazookas of machinery, figuratively, literally, point those bazookas at the segments of the market that we need. Right now, they're overbuilding at the top of the market. We've got this giant gap in the middle. What we need is to change economic conditions so they shift their bazooka to the middle instead of the top. You can do this through the tax code. You can do it through changing financing, providing more government-backed financing, for instance, through Fannie and Freddie. There are a whole bunch of things you can do to make the math work better in the middle of the market. To me, that, at least within our economic system, is a much more efficient way of solving this problem, which is a market fall problem, than having the government go out and build stuff. Having worked at HUD before I was at the White House in the Obama years, HUD's been falling all over itself to hire agents to do a lot of the direct sort of interaction with the private market, whether servicing loans, making loans, or the like. So I don't know that we want to lean more into them doing things like building homes for themselves, which you hear folks advocate, to disintermediate the private market from all this. I think you just want to incentivize the private market to do what it is they do well, but do it in the segments of the market where we need their help. So that's how I think about the first question. It's inefficient. You're paying a lot of intermediary costs in this. But in a world in which the private market is creating these, is building supply, where that's a segment of the market's primary function, it just seems like we're kind of stuck with him as a bedfellow in this one way or the other. On the graph question, I'll give you an anecdote that captures this well. So back in the Obama years, we used to go to President Obama with this miserable chart of the supply overhang, and would point out how with the supply overhang, it was causing this downward spiral in prices, and it was just going to get this sort of reinforcing downward spiral. It was going to make matters worse until the supply overhang would go away, and then things might level out. And then you fast forward to now, and you've got like an inversion of the graph. It's a supply shortfall, which is driving prices up, which is this reinforcing path upward. So it literally is a mirror image of what we struggled with 10 years ago. And to explain the flip, you've got to explain, what led to the overage. And the oversupply back in the day was just a voracious appetite for mortgages, being driven pre-Dodd-Frank, that led to a dramatic oversupply in the market to effectively feed that MBS demand for mortgages. And it worked until it didn't. And the moment it didn't, capital pulled out of the market, and we found ourselves stuck with millions.
So to some
much
extent,
supply.
that was a financing anomaly.
Yeah, it really was,
Obviously,
driven by
it was a bubble. Yeah. I don't,
Well, then of course, the construction industry all but collapses.
Yeah.
They quit building. Demand eventually sort of rebounds. So demand comes back. Supply doesn't come back. Supply comes back initially at the top of the market, and it begins to move down and towards the middle of the market. But as we can talk about in a minute, the fixed costs of building a house are high enough that it really hasn't been able to penetrate the middle of the market very far. And so we've been stuck at that place for
well,
the
let's
last
talk
5-6
about
years.
that. And this is for Sean and David in whatever order you choose. David, why don't you start, and then we'll get to Sean. Let's talk about multifamily housing in the middle and also in the low end of the market. In fact, let's start with you, Sean, so we can talk about this missing middle, which I think in many cases of workplace housing for working people with middle incomes. And Jim et al. Has talked about, that's really where, we have obviously gaps in the low end as well. But what do you think are some of the solutions to helping to address this shortfall in supply in the middle market for workplace housing?
Well, I think that your previous panel and Senator Schumer, they have some ideas that would really help in that space. I can tell you that forever and into the future, State and local government are going to be strapped from a budget perspective. But there are vehicles, like I said, the Housing Investment Trust, where you've got states and you've got cities and counties that are sitting on trillions of dollars of pension money that could be invested and get a market rate of return, okay, into entities like the Housing Investment Trust or ULICO's J for Jobs program that builds multifamily housing. They could get a market-based rate of return. They create economic activity in the area, build workforce housing, kill a lot of birds with one stone, and build the middle class and alleviate a bunch of different problems and not have to raise taxes, not have to depend on other financing mechanisms or good tax credit programs that are all part of these packages that build these projects, but not totally reinvent the wheel. They're sitting on the resources to do it right now. And I've met and others have met with mayors and governors and state treasurers and saying, Nevada put in a program. Okay, we're building the biggest affordable housing project in the history of the state of Nevada. After working with the treasurer of the state of Nevada, they made a renewable loan program together that's not costing the state any money, and it's building affordable housing for the people of Nevada.
We are supposed to go to Q&A right now, but I want to make sure I give you a chance, David, to answer this question. And I also want to put in a plug for our version of which hitchhikes off of what Sean just said. So in our report, which I'd encourage folks to look at, the whole thing, but this part where we set up a facility at HUD wherein we evaluate these subnational programs that are adding affordable housing, often in the middle market space, and doing so in a way that the federal government doesn't have nearly the insights that the more local forces have. And if those programs look like they're doing a good job, you mentioned a couple as well, Bharat, if they look like they're doing a good job of building affordable units and they're undercapitalized, if they could do more with some extra resources, then the federal government would provide those resources. So it's kind of a force multiplier for ongoing building. Last, and if you keep kind of quick, we'll get to the Q&A. David, in particular, when it comes to low-income housing, LIHTC. So, LIHTC was expanded in the budget plan in a way that I think is at least potentially useful. But, we've heard reports that in D.C. and New York, you're talking about, $1 million, $2 million to build a unit. What can we do to help LIHTC be more effective in terms of adding to low-income housing?
Thanks for that question. So LIHTC, when it reaches folks with the lowest incomes and reaches furthest into that part of the market, it comes with gap financing. That could be the home program. It could be housing trust funds, either the national fund that's filled by Fannie and Freddie transactions or state housing trust funds. And it often comes with subsidies. We've done some back of the envelope math to estimate if the LIHTC expansion were to go forward serving the lowest income bracket at about the rate it has historically, we'd need about 250,000 incremental vouchers to sort of scale with the LIHTC expansion. So that would be one way to think about it. The Housing Trust Fund, I think, is interesting in part because both with the national and with their own state and local versions, communities overwhelmingly use that flexible money for gap financing to serve populations of special interest, right? So people with disabilities, older people, veterans, victims of domestic violence, some of these populations I've been highlighting as often locked out of what private market or even LIHTC development would just do without an additional effort. Communities, when they have that resource, they find a way to reach those populations.
We have some time for questions and answers, so if you raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone. Oh, there we go, okay.
Hi, my name is Kara Ward. I'm a lawyer in town, and I focus on mortgage public policy and the intersection of law and regulation. My question is for you, Bharat, and perhaps for you, Mr. Parrott, and I'm thinking about when we get back to more demand-side policies and the ability of Americans to save for a down payment. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've sort of kind of compress that conversation. And I think part of it's likely responsible because of appropriate federal student loan repayment policies. I mean, the public student loan forgiveness and income-based repayment is actually a very big down payment assistance program. Federal student loan programs are changing right now again. And sort of thinking about what's going to be the future and the policies to support the ability of families to save for a down payment while they're in their 20s and 30s and repaying pretty expensive student loan costs.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. There's good academic data showing that, over the last 10 or 20 years, as student loan debt loads have gotten higher, it is correlated with inability to save for a down payment. It's correlated with the fact that people tend to be buying their first home later and later in life. Obviously in the Biden administration, we tried to take a variety of tacks to reduce student loan debt burdens on folks, which I think, among many other things, would have made it a little bit easier for people to buy a home. Obviously, the Trump administration is going completely in the opposite direction, making it harder for people who've done 10 years of public service to actually get the student loan relief that they're entitled to under the law, making income-based repayment programs less generous. And it's another way of exacerbating the crisis that we have. So, like I said, there's two sides of the equation here, and I think for good reason. We spent a lot of time focusing on how do we bring down the cost of housing. But as I said, there is this flip side to the coin where one person's bringing down the cost of housing is another person's bringing down the cost of their key asset. The kind of no regrets way of trying to address the problem is by improving the other side of the equation, which is by raising people's income and wages and reducing some of their own liabilities, whether it's on student loan debt or credit card debt and so on. And so I want us to remember that, with the caveat that Jim and others have pointed out, which is that with the housing-specific demand-side programs, whether that's some kind of renter's tax credit or down payment assistance, if you're in a world where supply is very constrained, the value of that subsidy tends to get eaten up by higher prices. And so we need to be thinking about broader policies to help the asset side of the equation.
Hold for a second. Is there another question? Okay, we'll give that gentleman the mic.
Hi, I'm Sarah Schott. I'm a senior fellow at Data Foundation and commercial building owner with another question. For areas that are not urban centers, it's become quite a challenge to develop multifamily construction talent outside of in more rural areas or suburban areas even. I was wondering what the panel thought about that talent pipeline in terms of building affordability, affordable housing, having the capacity to build, rural jobs outside of cities. Like, there's so many intertwined issues.
Yeah.
And do you see any promising programs, incentives? What can we be doing to make sure that it's not just boomers building?
Such a great question. Thanks for bringing that in. Sean, if you could take that, and if there's anything on the apprenticeship side that is relevant there, feel free.
Well, nationwide, we run in excess of 280 what we call apprenticeship readiness programs. They're, for one of a better term, pre-apprenticeship programs to prepare people for registered apprenticeship. They're done in major suburban areas. They're done in rural areas. They're done sometimes by congressional districts, sometimes built around a large project investment. We do not have problems attracting people into our apprenticeship readiness programs and then to our apprenticeship programs because they know that the unionized apprenticeship system, when it ends, you have landed squarely in the middle class with middle class families sustaining wages and a slew of very good benefits from health care to post-retirement security for you and your family. Sometimes the race to the bottom in the multifamily or home building community, where a lot of people are actually 1099 employees. They're not even employees of a contractor. They're transient in the workforce, and they're looking for another opportunity. So it's hard to recruit people when they don't see a pathway to the middle class through the construction industry in that scenario, where through the unionized building trades and apprenticeship readiness and registered apprenticeship, they know that that pathway is certain when they achieve journey person status.
Can I follow up on that just really briefly? So to reinforce how important this is and how it could get worse before it gets better, if you go back and look at trend lines of folks born in the United States who were interested in moving into the construction industry, you see that if you go back several decades, you see the numbers fall. It didn't impact the ability of builders to build homes dramatically because you saw immigrants, first-generation immigrants, filling that gap. So now as we're going to see first-generation immigrants, at least for the next couple of years, falling off a bit, this problem is going to become biting more than it has been before. So unless you can find something that makes it more attractive to move into that pipeline for folks who were born here, the loss of labor as a result of the fall off in immigration will be dramatic and will leave us in this supply shortage for years to come. I mean, the fixation of the current administration on immigrants as a source of the problem for housing affordability is wonderfully ironic because setting aside whether or not you think it's a demand problem or not, I tend to think it's not, at least broadly speaking. Having immigration fall off dramatically in the way that they would like creates a gigantic supply problem because they're responsible for a disproportionate amount, certainly in certain states, of the construction labor force. And as they fall off, unless you've got somebody coming in to fill that gap, it's going to be really hard for the construction industry to keep up with demand. And so the ditch that we're in is going to get deeper and not shallower.
It's one very quick thing, which is I'm glad that we're focusing on this question of housing outside of urban centers. A lot of our focus tends to be on that. You tend to have, traditionally, 20, 30 years ago, pre-financial crisis, you would have a lot of smaller home builders working in, sort of ex-urban and rural areas. American Economic Liberties Project put out a great paper a couple of months ago detailing how the mechanisms we had as a government for helping get financing to smaller home builders have really deteriorated over time. And I think that if we care about also making sure that we're having more home building in those types of communities, some of the reforms in that paper are worth looking at to provide financing to the outside the few big publicly traded home builders.
Let me close. How much time do we have left? Oh, great, 5 minutes. I have a closing question, but before I get to that, any other questions from the floor? There's a question right there.
We have one on the floor, and then we also have an online question.
Oh.
Thanks. I'm Kevin Killeen. I was wondering if you could make the pay packages more attractive by separating out the pension. Like over half of the trade union people never collect a pension, so they're leaving the money on the table.
Okay, we'll ask Sean.
And the same with healthcare, to make not just building trades, but people that are working gig economy or non-traditional hours to make the pay.
Okay, let me stop you there just because in the interest of time. Let's take that other question from the online, and then we'll just quickly answer both of those, and then I'll give you my final. Michael?
This is a kind of a summary of some of the questions that we've been getting online, but there's an interest in an assessment on the various ideas that the Trump administration has put out recently. A ban on institutional investors from buying up homes, a 50-year mortgage, buying $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities. Are these good ideas, and what do they mean for the upcoming year?
Well, I should give that to Jim, but I'm going to start on that one. I'm going to take that for myself, greedily. But first, did you want to address the pension issue at all?
Yeah, I don't know where you get your statistics from, but cutting people's health care and their avenue for post-retirement security, again, would exacerbate the problem. Does everybody make it through? It's 5-year vesting, by the way. So you only need to be in the career for 5 years to get a vested pension that you're entitled to when you retire. And generally speaking, it takes 90 days, 120 days to qualify for health insurance.
All right, let me stop you there just because I want to get back to the real topic at hand here. Let me quickly go through why I think the Trumpian initiatives are likely to do more harm than good. Very quickly. So a 50-year mortgage has two foundational problems. First of all, by definition, it means you'll take a much longer time to build up the home equity that Bharat was talking about. And secondly, because lenders are going to demand a term premium for locking their resources up for that long a period, it'll push up the mortgage rate. So even any savings you might think on a monthly basis would be illusory. I'll let Jim talk about the MBS. I heard some praise on the panel for the blocking the investment properties, and I certainly understand that. I think there are ways in which those big investors come in, even though they have a tiny share of the market, they can come in with cash only and really crowd out, regular folks trying to buy a house. So I'm very sympathetic to that. But when it comes to supply, all that does is shuffle around the existing supply. You end up having fewer rental properties because you're taking rental housing off the market, and more home ownership properties. And at least the research I've seen is either that's a wash or it actually ends up making rents more expensive than the savings on home ownership. So those two, I think, are pretty bad ideas. But do you want to take the...
Yeah, the $20 billion, the $200 billion idea. So for those of you who haven't been following it, Trump announced the other day that he was going to ask effectively the GSEs, I'll let him describe it that way, to buy $200 billion worth of MBS to bring in mortgage spreads. Effectively, when you flood the market with extra demand, which is what this would do, MBS demand, that is, it raises effectively the premium that MBS investors are willing to pay, which is passed on as savings to
Just
borrowers.
in the interest of time, I'm going to say it lowers the mortgage rate.
Or it lowers mortgage rates, yeah. It really depends on how they do this. The early indication is from Pulte. I mentioned his name as a caveat because it may be that the way he thinks about this is not the way it ultimately lands. But if the way he thinks about it is the way this plays out, they're going to buy $200 billion worth of MBS over the next few months. If indeed they do that, it's an overwhelming amount of purchase over the next few months, given the supply of MBS in the market. You'll see mortgage rates come down by 15, 20 basis points over the stretch during which they're doing this. The problem is the moment the market sees it light at the end of the tunnel, that is, they see that the $200 billion is going to run out, spreads are going to go back to exactly where they were before the announcement. They're going to push back out. Borrowers will see a loss of whatever they gained over this next 2 months. So the question is it worth investing $200 billion to effectively buy 2 or 3 months of 20 basis points of savings? It turns out that $200 billion is about the amount of capital the GSEs have to spend on something like this. So you're talking about taking the GSE's capital down to zero or having them issue debt to do this. So it's unclear to me whether or not the policy lift you get out of this, given how limited it is in both the impact and the duration, is worth the cost. They could structure it differently. If you had Bessent and company involved who were a little more sophisticated about these things at Pulte, you could imagine the GSEs being a sort of buyer of last resort in the MBS market. That might mean that the savings borrowers see is extended out over time a little bit longer. But so there are different ways in which you might do it that would make more sense than the way they seem to be.
But I think there's another problem, which is that if you lower the mortgage rate, you increase demand for housing.
Yeah,
and given everything we've talked about in terms of the near-term fixed supply, that just pushes up the price.
Yeah.
So as an affordability play, it's not.
So back to the very beginning of the conversation. Trump and company seem to be going big mainly on demand side stuff.
Yeah.
The institutional property stuff's a little different. But it seems like the early indications are from what Trump is leaning into, he's going for demand side stuff, not supply side stuff, which goes back to what Bharat said. Supply side stuff all takes a long time to have an impact. So you can imagine going to the Roosevelt Room and saying to President Trump, when he says, what are we going to do about this? You say, I've got these great ideas, and your successor is going to benefit from them by lower home prices. What do you think he's going to say to that? Yeah. So as a result, we're probably not going to see much supply side stuff.
I want to say one quick, put in my own objection here, which is that I think one of the things that the president is doing is trying to hack the Fed. We know that he's already on a jihad against, Chair Powell and all that, but I think he's trying to figure out how he can lower interest rates without the Fed. And I think he's looks at that 20 bips
on institutional investors very quickly.
Yeah, but all same thing with credit cards. He's trying to find ways to lower interest rates, and I'm worried that will end badly. Sorry.
I would just say on institutional investors, I think the nuance from my perspective is that housing is a set of local markets, not a national market. And so just talking about the percentage that institutional investors own at the national level, I think doesn't necessarily capture the issue. In certain areas of the country, the percentage is much higher than what it is at the national level. And it's accelerating quickly, and a lot of the homes that are coming on the market are getting bought up by institutional investors. So it seems to me like the kind of thing that state and local governments can be looking at. But I just want to make clear for everybody, Trump declaring that institutional investors can't buy anymore does not make it so, right? His announcement was a press release. It was not actually a set of policy changes, and it always reminds me of one of my favorite scenes from The Office, where Michael Scott is going through financial problems and somebody tells him about declaring bankruptcy. So he walks into the office and he says, "I declare bankruptcy." Okay? It does not make it so. You have to go through some steps to actually make it happen. And that I'm always reminded of that when Trump does these big announcements.
Well, Trump may be interested in bankruptcy, but I hope not. Yeah, that's a friendly amendment to what we were saying before, and I very much take your points. I mean, it doesn't add supply.
No, I agree. I think that we should remember that housing, at the end of the day, is a very intensely local issue.
Yeah.
And that a lot of us spend time thinking about federal policy because we work there. But, local markets can be very different from one another. Even a few blocks down the street can be a very different type of market. And so that local policy, I think we should afford more flexibility at the local level.
Let me end the panel with everybody, starting with you, David, talking about if we're sitting here in January of next year, what would be something that would have happened over the course of this year in the housing space, in the housing affordability space, that you would look back on and say, great, really glad that happened last year and really made a difference for the part of this that I care most about. You start, and then we'll go down the line.
Sure. I'll take the opportunity to take a little bit of a left turn because we've talked about the supply and the demand side of transactions. And to get back to the question of what superpowers the federal government has, one of them is to ensure underlying conditions of fair play. That's a piece I feel is very much at risk right now. So in addition to the Trump administration kind of making noise on the demand side, whether it does much there, they're also eroding fair housing protections, civil rights protections, home and community-based services that people need to live independently, to be able to stay in their housing and not end up institutionalized. So that to me is a massive risk that we all face as a country. So if we're able to slow the brakes, to see Congress assert through its oversight authority and its appropriating authority that we need the federal government to ensure underlying fair play on both sides of this transaction. You don't really have a contract unless both parties entered into it as equal negotiators, and that's what fair housing and civil rights enforcement and investigation are about. I would feel better in a year's time if we had made some traction on that threat.
That's a great point. It's a great point, and it's one that you don't hear enough. So thank you for bringing it to the panel. Sean.
I would very quickly, a year from now, see many states and local municipalities and counties make pretty dramatic changes to their zoning laws, and also have them invest in vehicles via their pension funds that they're sitting on, those trillions of dollars, into market-based returns for their funds for the investment, but the side benefit of creating good union or middle-class family-sustaining jobs and building, like we are at HIT right now. We have 38 projects that will go this year. 32 are under construction. We'll create 5,300 new units. 80% of them affordable. I think that cities and counties and states could do that, and we could work with them to help them achieve that.
80%, that's amazing. By the way, we hear a lot of statistics about, I didn't want to go through them in the introductions, you already heard them about housing inaffordability, but one that doesn't get enough attention speaks right to Sean's wish, which is around 60% of residential land in the largest 240 metropolitan areas in the country are subject to a maximum height of 2 to 3 stories. So 60% of the land subject to maximum height restrictions, 2 to 3 stories, and that's about the height of a single family home. Buildings of 5 or more stories were allowed on only 7% of total residential land. So it just gives you a sense of how upzoning can free things up. Jim?
Yeah, two things. One, picking up on the zoning idea, I would love to see a template developed at the federal level for what an acceptable form of local land use looks like. And by acceptable, I mean a form of land use that will have more federal funding flowing into a community, more carrots that will affect the flow of HUD funding, affect the flow of...
Why not some sticks?
Well, if you have a big enough carrot, it becomes a stick, is the way I think about it. So communities rely heavily on a lot of federal funding, DOT funding, HUD funding. And so Jimmy Carter, when he wanted the speed limit reduced to whatever it was, 55, he threatened to withhold DOT funding. When Reagan wanted the drinking age to go up to 21, he threatened to withhold DOT funding. So if it's a big carrot, it becomes a stick. So, but a template, the first step in all this is coming up with a template that we can all agree would be an idealized way for communities to handle density, and then we can all talk about what flows of funding should come behind that. Those that adopt it. Second piece, really quickly. If we begin to see thought given to changes in the tax code that provides significant relief for those that build exactly the supply we want in the middle of the market, that would be a huge step forward.
Okay. I got revenue concerns, but that's
deficit spending, baby.
Yeah, so those are great ideas, and the first one seems like something you and your team could write up. So that's my assignment to you, Bharat.
I have two quick ones as well. Number one. My old boss, Senator Warren, worked on a bipartisan bill with Senator Scott that makes it's called the Road to Housing Act, and makes a whole set of changes that would make it easier to build supply. It passed the Senate unanimously, which is basically impossible for anything that's more substantive than naming a post office, and yet it's just sitting there languishing in the House. They could pick it up and pass it, and I think that would make a big difference in the short term. The other thing is I wrote a paper recently with Emily DeVito, who I think I see in the audience. It has a bunch of ideas. I think the one that's most the one that would have the most short-term effect is mortgage assumability. Right now, there's a lot of people out there with mortgages in the 2 or 3% range. They don't want to sell their home because they know that if they buy a new home, they're going to get a mortgage in the 6% range. Assumable mortgages allows somebody to buy a home and assume the lower cost mortgage on it. Right now, actually, people probably don't know. I didn't know this before this, that FHA and VA loans already have this capacity, but it's very hard to execute it. So you could make it easier for for that transaction to go through, and then you could also explore ways of expanding the pool of loans that are subject to assumability.
So we're about to end, and before we do, and this is less a concluding remark and more a granular policy question for you on that, because I keep hearing about this, and my understanding, thing is a fact, is that all the mortgages that people hold at this point are contracts, and so to break or rewrite those contracts would be awfully challenging. It would have pricing implications for MBS. So the assumable mortgage idea, which I think may be a good one, seems to be a good idea to prevent the next episode of rate lock, not the current episode.
Yeah, I would say quickly on that, first of all, you have the FHA and VA population, which is already assumable, but it's very hard to actually execute those transactions. So you could deal with a chunk of the market, and obviously those tend to be middle income, low income folks. So I think that's a particularly useful area to explore, and there's some low hanging fruit in terms of making that easier. You're right, changing the rules and making current mortgages assumable or making it easier for that to happen is a trickier thing that will have an impact on MBS investors. As with all policy change, there's going to be winners and losers, and you just got to figure out what you're comfortable with.
So I'll end. I'm sorry, we don't have time for any more questions. I don't think, right? Yeah. So I'll end with my own one comment on the thing I hope for. I'd like to see a lot more churn come back into the labor market. I hope a year from now we're talking about the housing market. I hope a year from now we're talking, well, actually in the labor market as well, but that's a different topic. I hope a year from now we're talking about a housing market where there's a lot more buying and selling going on, in part because of some of the policies you've heard about today, though heavy lift given current politics, but in part just because that gap between outstanding interest rates and the average mortgage rate outstanding and the spot rate, closes up a bit, as it has been, and even a few basis points compression of that gap between, again, the average of rates that people are holding and the rate on the spot market there's a lot of pent-up movement there, a lot of pent-up churn, refis, buying. Want to get out of your house and into a different house. So I'm hoping that a year from now, maybe market forces and maybe some Fed rate lowering lead to smaller spreads and greater churn. On that note, please thank the panel, and that would conclude our event.